It's a new week. We have a new lunar cycle. As we saw that last week, there was a Taurus new moon where all the themes were around getting grounded, looking at our routines and how we really get situated and nested into our homes and our spaces, enjoying our sensory things, where we place value. And this week is still very much on theme with that, but more so, there's a lot of transits that are all about moving away from the more cerebral, over intellectualizing things and energy and moving into how do you actually physically feel about this situation? Intuitively, deep down, what's that gut reaction, the more physiological versus cerebral? And also, how can we keep ourselves grounded as we see that two major asteroids will be going retrograde this week as well? Though I don't want to, worry you or freak you out or anything like that. We'll be diving deep into them, what they mean for each of us. But also, asteroids in general don't impact us as acutely as the major planets do. So with that said, let's dive in. Hello, friends. It's your girl, Alina, your friendly neighborhood astrologer, and welcome to my little corner of the internet. In this video, we will be diving into the week ahead and my astrology forecast for it, namely for May 13th through the 19th. As always, the number one way to support my work is to hit the like button. And if you haven't already, if you'd like to get my astrology readings, namely for each lunation, so each full and new moon directly emailed to you, then sign up for my astrology newsletter, which will be linked in the description box below. All right, first up on Monday, May 13th, we know that Monday is ruled by the moon, and on Monday, the moon will be ingressing into the sign of Leo. Now, when we see that the moon enters a sign of Leo, it can definitely amplify and offer a lot more supportive energy when it comes to expressing ourselves, holding space for our inner child, and allowing our creativity to flow through, really sort of letting go of anything that's weighing us down in terms of worrying about other people's perception or judgment of us. That's something that's so beautiful and a potent lesson of the Leo energy. But we also see that when the moon enters the sign of Leo, it really amplifies whatever state that the sun is in, because the sun is the ruling astral body of Leo. So with that said, we see that the sun in Taurus will be conjuncting Uranus in Taurus. So like I said in the introduction, with this type of transit, it's really the type that is urging us to move away from overthinking too much and move into tapping into our intuitive knowing. Not overthinking things, not over intellectualizing things, especially when it comes to your relationships, your routines, the things that ground you, and the things that you value most. So that being relationships, but also consider things like finances. Taurus rules over the second house, all about finances. So when we see that the sun and Uranus come together in this way, the sun is how we see ourselves, how we'd like the world to see us. It's all about the ego, our perception of ourselves. And Uranus is all about innovative change, innovative growth. And sometimes the change can be a bit rapid or unexpected, but ultimately it's tied to an evolution and not really degradation or anything that's necessarily, in the grand scheme of things, deeply negative necessarily. And so when they come together in the sign of Taurus, the sign that, again, all about our relationships, how we connect with one another, romance, but also things like finances and the things that we place value upon, this transit, it just feels a lot easier to embrace change because we're not holding too tightly on to things and we're open-minded to innovation and growth in that way. And so again, there might be situations that you have on Monday or on the time of Monday where there might be some changes or some shifts, and it'll help you most to ask yourself deep down, how do you feel about it? Like literally on a physical level versus overly explaining it away. So for example, someone might feel stressed, right? And they might explain in their head like, oh, well, you feel stressed because of this and because of that. But ultimately, you're feeling stressed right now, and it might be good to nurture yourself and take care of yourself that you're not feeling stressed. I hope that explains it. Now, even though Uranus is associated with some change and that can be associated with a bit of stress, I will say that Monday should be a pretty chill day because we see that Venus, also in Taurus, will be sextiling Saturn that's currently in Pisces. Now, when we see these astral bodies come together in this way, it can actually be a pretty calming and easy, soft sort of energy to it. And that's because we see that Saturn, though it is considered the strict teacher, It's transiting the sign of Pisces, which is a water sign. It's all about our emotions, allowing our emotions to flow, expression of our inner world, and also our intuition. And considering that Venus is at play, Venus is about love and relationships are all about our connections and our emotional connections. When they come together in a complementary sextile, it can create a very conducive environment for vibing with people, for being on the same wavelength with others and with ourselves, and for there not being that much friction when it comes to expression, whether that's expression with people we're in a relationship with, but also even just by ourselves, expressing to ourselves, tapping into our own emotions and what that means for us. And it's ultimately tied to growth because it involves Saturn. So overall, on Monday, we see that, the moon enters the sign of Leo. It's really, again, going back to expression. It's really complementary and energetically supportive when it comes to holding space for our creativity, allowing our imagination and our inner child and our ideas to flow unhindered by worrying about other people's perception. So it can feel a lot easier there. There's this easier transit with Venus and Saturn having this sextile when it comes to our relationships and emotional flow. And then we see that the sun conjuncts Uranus in Taurus, where it's bringing this very open-minded, more innovative air to the collective's ego and to our collective sort of perception of what could be and what should be. And it leaves us very open to more open-minded and progressive approaches to changing things. So I think that Monday should flow relatively smoothly. Next up, on Tuesday, May 14th, we see that Tuesday is ruled by Mars. Mars is a planet of action, aggression, assertion, and dominance. It's considered the planet of war in a lot of ways, and it's the ruling planet of Aries. So think about that being very assertive, speaking your truth, speaking up for yourself, and being an advocate, taking that initial initiative. There's this energy imbued on Tuesdays in general of there being a lot of supportive energy around taking action in a lot of ways. And what's interesting is that we see on Tuesday that Ceres, the asteroid that is named after the mythological goddess of agriculture and fertility, while in Capricorn, will be going retrograde. So with that said, let's go ahead and back up and break this all down. So Ceres is an asteroid that is one of the more recent astral bodies that's been discovered. It's not really acknowledged in traditional astrology for that reason, but Ceres is an asteroid, again, named after the goddess of agriculture and fertility, and it's known to directly influence our own sort of creativity, fertility, manifestation, and namely how we nurture ourselves and others. How are we nurturing and nourishing ourselves? So think about, how are you pouring into yourself? You know what I mean? Whether that's through self-care or through different actions that are supporting your health, or how do you support and pour into others in that way, right? And so when we see that Ceres is transiting the sign of Capricorn, it offers this layer of making it so in order to nurture others, it's most conducive to do that through practical, structured, routine approaches. And that's because, as many of y'all know, Capricorn is all about practicality, being in action. A lot of it has to do with also status and things like that. And so there's a bigger emphasis also even on our careers as well when Ceres is transiting Capricorn. And so when we see that on Tuesday, the 14th, it goes retrograde, it can tend to usher in experiences where we are called to reassess how we are nourishing others. And so when we see Ceres in Capricorn going retrograde, it can usher in a period of time during this retrograde where we're called to kind of circle back to and reassess how we approach our responsibilities and how we give care to others. Imagine a situation where maybe you're trying to offer advice to somebody or help somebody and they're like, I don't need your help in that way. Like the way that you're trying to help me right now is counterintuitive, or it's not helping me in some way. Or, I thought that you were going to help me more, or I did not ask you for help. And think about that conversation not only coming from others to you, but maybe you're needing to set boundaries with other people trying to help you, or you're having that conversation with yourself, which is even more likely because when we see any astral body going into retrograde, it creates a situation where we tend to internalize things a lot more. But ultimately, this retrograde is offering us opportunities to reflect upon how we are nurturing and nourishing ourselves and others, and whether or not it's even efficient. So throughout this week, you might have some of these things kind of pop up where there's a bit of feedback given to you, or you need to give feedback to others where you're like, I know that you are trying to get it across this way, but maybe that's not as efficient as you think it was. And ultimately, that's there because we all need some form of course correction, right? We're not all born right, going in the right direction forever, right? It's all about course correction and learning, evolving, and that's through the experiences that we have with everybody else in this world. We are community-based organisms, but this can also manifest as it being by yourself. And Capricorn is a feminine sign, so considering that Ceres is in this sign, it does have to do with the divine feminine and nurturance in that way. And also abundance, because it also has to do with agriculture. What comes to mind is a queen in a garden, and there's all this abundance. And it's about how this garden is managed and how it is watered in order for it to thrive, right? And so this retrograde is really bringing up these themes of like, am I watering it right? Or like, is someone watering me right? And are these relationships and these situations equitable? And just course correcting. There doesn't necessarily need to equate to there being drama or issues or anything like that, but really staying open-minded to feedback, whether that's feedback from people or from the universe. Next up, May 15th on Wednesday, we know that the day is ruled by Mercury. So Wednesday is a great day for networking, communicating with people. There's a lot of energetic support within that space. We also see that the moon enters the sign of Virgo on Wednesday, not only imbuing the next few days with a lot of supportive energy when it comes to building routine and structure. You see what I mean? How this week there's a lot of these themes, but also we see that with the moon being in Virgo, Virgo is ruled by Mercury. It is amplifying the state of Mercury on top of Wednesday being a mercurial day. So when we look to Mercury, we see that it will be entering the sign of Taurus on Wednesday. Mercury rules all things out of air. So it rules over communication, learning, information exchange. Think of the internet. This is why during Mercury retrograde, they say like, double check your emails, spell checks, make sure that you don't have miscommunication, because Mercury rules all of these things. It also rules short-term travel. And so when we see that Mercury ingresses from being in the very high energy cardinal sign of Aries and into the more grounded and steady sign of Taurus, it really imbues the next few weeks with this sort of energy of just slowing down a bit, especially when it comes to our approach to second house themes. So think of our finances, our relationships, and the structures and the foundations that we have there, what makes us feel grounded within those spaces. And when we see Mercury going into Taurus, it really offers a lot more of these themes around, and you'll likely have these experiences where we're being called to explore how we can approach these things from a steady perspective. So not rushing into a relationship, not rushing to get a reply or to give a reply, but really being a lot more strategic about our spending, about our finances, and about our relationships. In that it's like, okay, let me pause for a sec to think about this. Let me schedule something, put something in the books. Let me approach it in a lot more of a steady way. And this can be very helpful because, again, we see that with Ceres going retrograde in Capricorn, there are also these themes that have to do with our practicality, our structure, our sense of responsibility. And so Mercury going into Taurus is very helpful for that, especially coming out of Mercury retrograde. Like, we left officially the post-retrograde shadow period on May 12th of last Sunday. So seeing that we're now going into this more grounded sign for Mercury, I feel like a lot of us are going to, especially if you felt Mercury retrograde hit you really hard, things are going to be steadying out a lot more. And think of the areas of your life that you might have noticed these mishaps in, and think about and really maybe even set intentions of how you're ready for those to be grounded moving forward into this new phase with Mercury. All right, next up on Thursday, May 16th, we know that Thursday is ruled by Jupiter. So it can be a very lucky and expansive day, a great day for doing something that you need a little extra juju to support you with. But with that said, we see that on Thursday, Pallas, an asteroid that is named after a Greek goddess and is associated with our critical thinking skills and conflict resolution, will be going retrograde in the sign of Scorpio. So a little background there. Pallas is named after the Greek goddess Athena and is associated for that reason with her ability to strategically plan when it came to arguments, disagreements, war, and things like that, aggression. A great way to describe it is if Aries, ruled by Mars, is associated with aggression when it comes to conflict resolution, Pallas is associated with being very strategic, being very calculated, and taking your time to make the next response or make the next move. And almost think of like a shadow aspect of it is a bit manipulative in a way to get what you want without having to exert that knee-jerk reaction of aggression. You know how like you have that knee-jerk reaction of like immediately being aggressive, and then sometimes you might be upset about something, but you hold that energy in and you're like, you know what? I'm going to think about this and I'm going to come back to it. That is what Pallas energy directly influences. And so when we see that Pallas is in the sign of Scorpio, it can really enhance our ability to not only critically think, but see even deeper when it comes to the underlying motives behind people and their actions, along with our own motives. Scorpio energy is very intuitive. Scorpio energy, ruled by Pluto, is very heavily tied to being able to easily identify the shadow aspects of things, the shadow aspects of people. And so in general, when we see Pallas already transiting Scorpio, it can make it so our thought processes can be a lot more observant, but also sometimes a lot more negative. And when I say negative, I don't mean that in a detrimental way. I think it's more so, it's easier for our minds to wander and land on deeper rooted causes behind sometimes unexplained behaviors that are frustrating to us. Even our own behaviors, it's easier for us to tap into that. It aids us in also dealing with the more psychological complexities of ourselves and others. Now, when we see that Pallas goes into retrograde, which will happen on Thursday, just like any retrograde where it can tend to kind of drum up old things and have it kind of retrograde back into our lives, it can tend to elicit experiences that can tend to make us think about past situations where we maybe didn't deal with interpersonal issues the best way that we could have. And it tends to bring up older situations where we might still be holding on to something there, or we still feel a bit of resentment, jealousy. Think of like these more shadow emotions that we usually try to push down because we're like, I shouldn't be feeling this way, so I'm going to kind of shun that emotion, versus actually looking at it and asking ourselves, why do I feel resentment? Why do I feel jealousy? Why do I feel frustrated or angry or any sort of uncomfortable emotion that usually we try to hide or kind of pretend that we don't have because we have labeled it as bad? Now, on the flip side of that, if these things tend to come up for us, especially like if you notice it like this week, it can also be helpful to process that. Sometimes when things tend to reoccur, a great example of this is like in dreams. Like when you keep on having reoccurring type dreams that are tied to maybe memories or situations from your past, it's usually a reflection of your subconscious being like, here, please look at this thing, please process it. Like we still haven't processed it, and deep down, I don't feel good about it. And so on the flip side of Pallas going into retrograde in Scorpio, tied to these deeper wounds and things like that, Pallas is all about critical thinking and analyzing things and being analytical in the way that it can help us to be strategic and to plan things out and to process things. It can be helpful to actually look at these things that might be coming up and sit back and really ask ourselves, what did I learn from this? How can I maybe evolve? Is there a lesson here that I haven't fully learned yet? Or maybe is there a boundary? You know, what comes to mind as I describe this is something that I saw recently that was so, oh my gosh, it resonated so well. And it says, wherever you have resentment is usually a place where you should set a boundary. Because oftentimes resentment comes from there being a situation where something happened or someone did something that you didn't like, but you didn't voice it at the time. And so you have these unexpressed emotions that are bottled up for whatever reason. For example, if that's what it is, it's like, okay, I have this feeling, how can I prevent that from happening again? I can't change the past, but how can I approach it in a different way so that I don't feel this way moving forward? And sometimes that is setting a boundary. Sometimes that is communicating where you're at, allowing yourself to express that. Sometimes that is talk therapy or journaling. But ultimately, during this retrograde, that will be incredibly helpful if you're open to that, if you're open to reflecting on anything, especially if you feel like sort of kind of triggers are coming up later on this week. Next up, on Friday, May 17th, we know that Friday is ruled by Venus, and Venus is a planet of love and relationships, really imbuing the day with a sense of connection, making it a lot easier to pour into our relationships in that way. On Friday, we see that Mercury in Taurus will be squaring off with Pluto, which is transiting Aquarius. So when we see this type of transit in this square, we see that usually what can tend to happen is one of two things. There can be situations where we usually have to grapple with wanting to approach something from a more traditional way, that being the Mercury in Taurus, that grounded traditional sort of energy, and there being a push for change, innovation, acknowledging the shadows of things, and really growing based off of the shadows and the things that we are learning from in that way, that being the Pluto in Aquarius themes. Pluto in general is the planet of change, but it's this change that's associated with our shadows, with the necessary death in order to have a rebirth, and that we need to acknowledge the nitty gritty, the things that we usually are trying to avoid or push under the rug or procrastinate or look away from. And it's when we're able to face these things and really process them or transmute them in some way that we're actually able to grow and innovate. Like a great example of this is societally, like maybe, for example, in the US, like we have very dark aspects of our past in the US, right? But it's through acknowledging the harm that was done to, for example, Native Americans or things in the past, or for example, like say women's rights or something like that, right? That we can inform how we navigate the future and how we can make sure that things remain equitable or remain focused on considering these things to support people, right? In that same way, there can be, on a collective scale, this bigger sort of conversation around how we balance being more patient and planning and doing things in a slower pace, a more traditional space, and maybe just getting our hands dirty and getting in there and changing things up and seeing what happens and just trying to change things for the better because we can clearly see that there's a problem. Now, on a more interpersonal level, when we see this type of transit, because it involves Taurus with Mercury in our thinking, something having to do with our relationships, whether it's our closer relationships or the collective, and there being some type of a hiccup and us being called to reflect on, oh, there's actually an issue here and we need to actually like deal with it head on and talk about it. Or like maybe not talk about it like in a therapy setting, but we need to approach this from a new perspective in order to move forward. Like there might be some form of a disagreement or a butting heads or some type of a sort of stagnation, like going up against a wall that involves approaching things from maybe a more steady way versus a more fluid and rapid way, or approaching things in a way that it's like, oh, this is in my comfort zone. Like, for example, Mercury is all about thinking and it's in Taurus. So it's like, okay, well, this is my comfort zone and this is what I'm familiar with my thinking. And then there's something coming into play being like, actually, no, you need to think about that from a whole new perspective. And we need to dive a little bit deeper here, because if we don't, the same thing's going to keep repeating. The same problem's going to come up over and over again. And so I feel like, especially with these retrogrades, with a lot of these themes around Taurus and getting grounded, but also acknowledging where we have fallen short or where we maybe haven't handled situations properly, I feel like on Friday there might be coming to a bit of a head there where it's like, we need to approach this differently. We have to, unless we want it to repeat all over again. I said this in my last reading. The definition of insanity is doing things the same way over and over again and expecting different results. Like, this is that type of transit, Mercury and Taurus squaring Pluto in Aquarius. So ultimately, my advice, my tip for you is staying open-minded to the idea that maybe you have been approaching something the same way for a long time, especially with situations where it's like, man, I keep on feeling resentment, or I keep on feeling frustration, or I keep on feeling this. why does it keep happening? Like, what is repeatedly happening in the same way that is fostering these same results? And maybe what can you change in the part that you play to alter it? Sometimes that looks like setting boundaries, taking yourself out of the situation altogether. Sometimes that looks like meeting it head on and being like, hey, can I have a direct conversation about how this is making me feel? But ultimately on Friday, there will likely be some type of a situation that kind of is set in motion. Maybe it doesn't happen Friday, but likely over the weekend, where that type of topic is brought up of like, all right, are we going to keep doing this or are we going to try something different? Because this is a square. This is a not complementary type of transit. The other aspect of this transit that I also wanted to mention is that there's a potential of there being a slight breakdown in communication because it involves Mercury, where when it's squaring off with Pluto, there's that sort of upset, or Pluto can interrupt Mercury's sort of influence when it comes to communication. So be careful with your words as well. But next up on Saturday, we know that Saturday is ruled by Saturn. So Saturn is imbued with a lot of supportive energy from Saturn when it comes to growing into ourselves, learning lessons, taking aligned steps with our responsibilities, things like discipline, and listening to the callings that the universe has given us in terms of like growing into who we're called to be. Also, we see that on Saturday, the moon will be moving away from Virgo and moving into Libra, which is really not only going to be imbuing the day with an energy that's very supportive of diplomacy. So especially if on Friday there was a little bit of butting heads, there's a lot of lunar supportive energy when it comes to finding diplomacy, justice, and finding balance when it comes to our relationships, whether that's like you in a community, you in a closer relationship, or something like that. But another aspect of the moon entering Libra is that it really amplifies the state of Libra's ruling planet, which is Venus. And we see that on Saturday, Venus in Taurus will be conjuncting with Uranus, also in Taurus. Now, like I said at the beginning of the week, where we saw that the sun in Taurus conjuncted Uranus and Taurus, we saw the sun really influencing aspects of our ego coming together in the sign of Taurus with Uranus, the planet of innovation, expansion, and growth in a lot of ways, and change that is tied to that innovation and looking at things from new perspectives. That was, that transit, but seeing that we have another conjunction with Uranus, there's a lot of potential changes and shifts that are happening this week, but ultimately they are pertaining to growth in some way. And so when we see that Venus comes together with Uranus, we know that Venus is a planet of love and relationships. The moon is in Libra, so we have this air of diplomacy as well, and this supportive energy when it comes to balance within our relationships. And it's coming together with this planet of innovation and change. So you can kind of guess what these themes are really coming about on Saturday, and that a lot of it is tied to looking at and being open-minded to innovative change when it comes to our relationships, our finances, because we know Taurus and Venus are tied to that, and also our relationship with ourselves. In that there's a lot of supportive energy when it comes to exploring, like, okay, I've been doing things a certain way for a long time when it comes to my finances, and I still am not liking it. What is a new approach that I can do? Is it expanding our financial literacy? Is it pouring into our financial knowledge? Is it asking questions to people who've gone farther than us? Saturn being the strict teacher, it also has to do with this wisdom that we're being called to learn. And so I feel like on Saturday, or even on like Wednesday, is another good day for this, but reaching out and asking for help, especially when it pertains to our finances, can be very expansive right now. But ultimately, Venus conjuncting with Uranus is a relatively positive transit because it really helps with, especially like innovative sort of downloads coming about for us. And again, because it's in Taurus, it's pertaining to our relationships. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there's like these deep-rooted problems, although we likely will see some potential issues being highlighted because of the retrogrades we have going on and the transits that we have with Pluto and our shadow sides in that way. Ultimately, I feel like there's going to be a lot of themes around finances for a lot of us this week. Because there are so many planets in Taurus right now. It is so interesting. And a lot of them have notable transits with Uranus, a planet of change that's connected with innovation, and Pluto, a planet of change that's connected with the shadow aspects, the underbelly, the hidden aspects of our lives. So I find that to be really interesting. But the last transit that we see on Saturday will be when we see that the sun in Taurus will be conjuncting with Jupiter, also in Taurus, y'all. This is wild. So this is another even luckier and even more expansive transit in that we have the sun, this astral body, our central star, that is all about holding space for our inner world, our inner child. The sun is the ruling planet of Leo, and it directly impacts our ego and how we view ourselves, how we wish to present ourselves to the world. Think about almost like our mask that we put on to interface with others as well. And it's coming together with Jupiter, the planet of luck and expansion, like the lucky planet in our solar system, in the sign of Taurus. So there's very expansive and supportive opportunities when it comes to change, especially over the weekend, when it comes to looking at how we are approaching things differently. And the other thing too is that it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to have like these huge interpersonal shifts in our lives, but what it could also mean or look like is taking note of how far you've already grown, how far you've already changed, and taking note on what has been working for you. And when we lean into that, that's where that expansion and that luck can grow from. When we're like, oh, these things have actually been really great in my life pertaining to my relationships and my finances and my relationship with my material world in that way. So yeah, man, Saturday I think can be really great for that reason. And my general tip for Saturday is, especially when it comes to relationships, is consider having expansive conversations with your loved ones, asking them like, hey, like what has been something that you've enjoyed doing with me? Like what's the last sort of activity or conversation or thing that we've done that you've loved, or that you've done with others that you'd like to do together? Or what comes to mind is like relationship check-ins, so if you have a partner or anything like that, some people do monthly or bi-weekly or weekly check-ins where they're like, hey, how are you? Is there anything that I did this week that you really loved? Is there anything that maybe kind of bothered you a little bit? Like a lot of people hear that and they're like, that sounds so corporate, that's lame. But one of the reasons why it works for so many people is that resentment can easily build if we don't speak our truth, if we don't let people know how something made us feel. And so creating an environment that's routine, structured, grounded in Taurus, that's very Taurus themes of being grounded and routine and predictable in that way, and leaning into these Libra themes, the moon being in Libra, making things equitable. Doing this sort of check-in could actually be very, very beneficial. This could also be beneficial for your closer like friendships as well. Like doing a check-in like, hey, I'm not mad at you. I'm assuming you're not mad at me, but I heard about this thing where we can kind of do a check-in and see like, what are things that have been working for us that you're loving? And is there anything that you maybe want to talk about or that's been on your mind? Like I want to co-create a space where we can openly talk about these things, and just creating that space to, again, prevent any sort of buildup or frustration, I think definitely can be very, very helpful on Saturday. But finally, on Sunday, we see May 19th. Sunday is ruled by the sun. It's a great day for receiving energy, receiving the revitalizing light rays of the sun in that way. It's a great day for drawing your energy back to yourself. And I think that it's no coincidence that we have, religious meetings and gatherings on Sundays for that reason. Sundays are also associated with leadership, vitality, and expressing ourselves. The sun is the ruling planet of Leo. So think of those themes of shining bright, not being afraid to hide aspects of yourself and taking initiative and taking on a leadership role. But on Sunday, with, the sun's energy being more acutely felt, we see that the sun in Taurus will be sextiling Neptune in Pisces. Now, Neptune in Pisces as is very interesting, because Neptune is the ruling planet of Pisces. It's a very deeply intuitive water ruling planet. And so when we see that it has a complementary sextile with the sun in Taurus, what it can tend to do is make it so we can more clearly see and tap into sustainable approaches to our creative flow and our expression. So an example of this is like maybe one day you have great creative flow and you're like coming up with these ideas and you're documenting it, or you're expressing it, or you're painting it, or you're playing it on a guitar or something like that. And you're like, wow, that was like such a perfect day. Or maybe you have a day where you're making these connections and your inner world is really flowing through, you know, or in general, actually on Sunday, it'll be highly likely that over the course of the weekend, at the beginning of next week, you might remember your dreams a lot easier. But getting back to my point, another example is like, say you have this flow of ideas and you're connecting these dots and you're expressing yourself very easily. And you're like, wow, I had these ideas come through. So when we see that the sun in Taurus sextiles with Neptune and Pisces, it can make it easier for us to either start or come back to practices that allow for that intuitive, expressive, creative flow and expression to happen on a more sustainable way. So for example, on Sunday can be a great day to do kind of like a Sunday reset where you're maybe scheduling out a time to be creative. What comes to mind is this concept that I've seen online, which is that naturally we think that creativity should just randomly come to us. And it does, and it should, in that it's like we're allowing our inner world to flow. But a misconception that many people have is that we shouldn't schedule time to allow for that creativity to flow because we think that it should just happen whenever. But a great example of this is, I think it was like Jerry Seinfeld or something. There's this really big comedian. He talked about how every single day he wrote a joke. He had a notepad and he wrote a joke down. Whether it was good or bad, he wrote a joke down. And by doing that, it was almost like he was strengthening this channel in his brain to allow for jokes to flow through. And as if it's like a muscle. He was strengthening that joke-making muscle. And it wasn't about every single joke being perfect. It was about writing down a joke. For anybody who might need to hear that, especially when it comes to creative pursuits and doing anything like that, or even expressing yourself and learning how to speak up for yourself, or allowing your inner world to come through, you know, this Neptune Pisces aspect of your inner world, and then the sun being how you're shining, how you're showing yourself, Taurus being that aspect of sustainability and grounding that and tying that to your identity with the sun. Explore if you can maybe schedule a time to express yourself. That could be scheduling a time to journal, scheduling a time for therapy, scheduling a time to paint. And oh my gosh, there's a saying. It's a saying from Facebook and people are like, oh, Facebook's lame. But it's still a good saying. And it says, move fast and break things. Which is basically like, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Because it's when you make mistakes and you experience failure that is when you learn the biggest lessons that you need to learn so that when you start again, you can approach it in a much more strategic way. You know what I mean? So with that said, that wraps up my weekly horoscope reading for y'all. I hope that you enjoyed this and I'm sending you my love. I'll wrap this up with my favorite quote, and that is, be gentle with yourself because life is about the journey, not the destination. All right, I'll see you on the next one.